Today we're going to add CSS to our project and we're going to use SASS preprocessor. So before we're going to get to our tasks, we're going to have to install some dependencies. I'm going to install all the packages in once. So we've got SASS, we've got gulp SASS and gulp source maps. This is a SASS compiler. Be careful with this one, don't use Node SASS or libsass. Make sure to use SASS. This is basically Dart SASS, the latest version of the SASS compiler. Gulp SASS and gulp source maps, those are gulp plugins. Now we can go to our gulp file and we're gonna require our packages that we just installed. So we're gonna require SASS. We're requiring gulp SASS, and then we pass to it the SASS compiler. And another one is source maps. So we're gonna add it here. So let's define our first SCSS task. And I call this one dev. This will become more obvious in a minute. We need our callback, and then we are gonna return the beginning of the stream. So what we're going to say, src, and here we're going to pass all the files that we want to put through our stream. So I'm going to say src, scss, and every file in this directory and subdirectories ending with scss extension. Next, we're going to pass our files through a SASS compiler. So we're going to say pipe, and we're going to say SASS. We want to say that if there is an error, so on error, we want to log SASS error to the console. So we're going to say SASS log error. And as our final pipe, we're going to say where we want to output compiled files. So we're going to say destination, and we're going to store them in public SCSS. Public CSS folder. Right, if you run this now, npx gulp scss dev, and if we check our public directory, we should see our files, but we didn't define any sources. So let's create a new folder, scss, and let's add some files, maybe app scss, and let's maybe say body background color, let's do red, and let's try this again. And now we can see that our CSS file was generated. I want to add source maps, so I'm gonna go back. Before we pass our files to a SASS compiler, we're gonna initialize source maps. So I'm gonna say source maps init, and then just before we output our compiled files, we're gonna have another pipe, and we're gonna write our source maps. If we run this again, hopefully we will see source maps along our app CSS file, and looks like it's working. So let's quickly add this to our HTML file. Gonna be CSS, app CSS, and let's start our dev task, npx gulp dev. So now we'll see that the background in our browser is red, and this is pretty good. Let's check our source maps. So if I maybe inspect the elements, and let's go to the body, and we can see we've got our app SCSS file coming through, and we can view it. So the source maps are definitely working. We don't have a watcher, so next we're going to define one. So I go back to a gulp file and define another task. Name of the task, SCSS watch. As always, we're going to have our callback here, and then we're going to use watch from gulp, and we're going to tell gulp which files to watch, and we want to watch everything in src, scss, and all the files ending with scss. So now we can execute task whenever any of these files are changed. So we're going to say series, we're just going to execute one task, which is scss dev If any SCSS file changes, we're gonna execute this task. Now, in order for this get to work, we're gonna have to pass our watcher to our dev task. So this is gonna get executed in parallel along other tasks. And now, if we try to run this npx gulp dev, and try to change the file, let's say green, and save, we'll see that the file was compiled, but let's check the browser and looks like it's working. Let's try it again. Maybe let's do gray. Now, the interesting thing about this is that browser sync is not going to reload our browser. Instead, it will stream a CSS straight into browser. So if, for example, we've got a very long page like this, we are working on a piece of footer and we're doing some styling and we're changing our files often. So let's say our background is pink. After saving, we'll see that the browser doesn't reload. It actually stays in place. So the styles are being injected on the fly into the browser. And this is very convenient. So we've got our styles working pretty well in dev mode. What about build? So let's go back to gulp file. Let's define another task called SCSS. We can copy this, remove dev, and we want to remove the source maps. And we want to minify our CSS files, and we can do that by passing an option to a SASS compiler. We're going to say output style to be compressed. So if we try to run npx gulp SCSS and check our app.css file, we'll see this gets compiled. So that works pretty good. And also source maps have been removed. For now, we're not going to worry too much about cleaning our CSS folder. We're going to deal with that in the future videos. As a final thing, what we need to do when we go back to our gulp file, we need to add our SCSS task to our build task. So after TypeScript was compiled, we're going to run our SCSS task. Let's try this, npx gulp build. It looks like everything is working. If this video helped you in any way, please remember to smash that like button or even subscribe. As always, I will include the link to the GitHub repository in the description. Thank you for watching.